Hello. It's time to start RADEXT interim meeting. And first, good day of time of day. For me, it's evening. For somebody, it's morning. And for somebody, it's day. And I'm Valery Smyslov, and my co-chair is Margaret Cullen. And we are going to discuss the drafts that were adopted. They were already adopted as working group documents, and also a few drafts, a couple of drafts that are candidates for adoption. So let's start. So first, this is a note well, and I think all of you know this very well, but it's another time to reread it if you forgot. So any contribution during this meeting is considered as a contribution during IETF, and I must also say that the meeting is recorded. This is IETF Code of Conduct. It's relatively new rules, but chairs are encouraged to remind participants about this Code of Conduct. And so we meet in details. You can find here links for meeting slides, for note, and for the lib. And so we have to perform a few administrative tasks. And first of all, we need the lib scribe. I'm not sure we really need it, but because the activity, there are very few people, and I can probably monitor the chat in Miteco. And anyway, we need 2 note takers. Any volunteers?
I'm happy to try and give it a go. Alex.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So
I noticed that the notes pointer seems to go to the notes for the last meeting, and I don't know what we're supposed to do.
I will try. Okay, it's probably my fault because we have to prepare and delete all the old stuff and add new items.
It says notes IETF-116-RADEXT.
Yes, I know, because okay. It should be deleted and just replaced with the new stuff from this interim. And so, Margaret, do you want to say something more? Because I see your hand.
Yeah, do we have another, I didn't mean to put up my hand, but do we have another notes taker?
Okay.
I took a few notes during the first hour, then I unfortunately have to leave. Hi, this is Hannes.
Okay, Hannes, if you can help, it would be great. So next, this is an agenda for the agenda for today's meeting. And I think that the first is chairs should provide. So first, any question for this agenda? So it seems that everybody is happy with this agenda. So first, chairs will provide the status for the current state of the working group. And Margaret, if you can do this. Margaret, can you hear me?
Am I unmuted now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
So can you, yes.
Can I what?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. I think as everybody on the call probably already knows, we adopted 3 working group documents since IETF-116. The TLS document, which we'll talk about extensively today, the radius version 1.1 document, which we used to refer to as the ALPN extensions, and the radius and TLS PSK document. So those three have been adopted. They're still being worked on in the working group, and we'll talk about them today. We have another document that I'm hoping we can make a call to adopt today. That's deprecating radius UDP and radius TCP. It used to be called, I think, deprecating insecure uses of radius, and we will talk about that today. And then we've been asked to review a document that Mark and Elliot, I think Mark is going to present, Mark Grayson, to us at the end of the meeting today, just to give us an idea what they're doing and get our feedback. So that's our status today. And we're moving along in schedule as far as I know. But we do want to try to get the other documents for our work items adopted. And the other thing that we're going to talk about today that's not on this slide is when we want our next meeting to be, whether we want to have another interim in June before the IETF meeting in late July or not. So be thinking about that, because we'll have a discussion on that at the end. So that's our status to date. No, hopefully no big surprises for anyone there. Any questions about that?
I think Hannes is showing his hand. Hannes, do you want to say something?
No, sorry. Sorry.
Okay.
That was saying.
Mark?
Okay. Mark Grayson, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a question on reverse COA. I saw that sort of timed out. And so is the intent to have that adopted?
Yes. I think, or actually it may be that it was overtaken by ALPN. Alan, are you on here? Do you want to comment on that? Or TLS PSK? What's going on with the reverse COA draft, Alan?
That still is going forward. It's independent of the other one.
Okay. But yeah, it expired, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
We'll
I'll do an update. The thought is, if we can get some of the other documents out of the way, that hopefully frees time to finish this rather than working on 6 different things at the same time.
All right. So why don't we go on to the first discussion? Jan-Fred has some slides. And I think, Jan-Fred, you're going to present the slides, and then we'll hold off discussion and then hold the discussion at the end. Is that what?
I will present the slide. So just, Jan-Fred, just say next when you send.
Not the right
yeah,
slide.
but that's the wrong slide deck. My slide deck was.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
For the RC6614. Okay. Yeah. So RFC6614B's the document that wants to make radius over TLS to a proposed standard and bumping it up from experimental. So after the working group adoption call, I haven't done any update on the document itself because I have read the other documents that refer to it or that are referred by it, and I've noticed some things that would, that requires a decision on how to move this document forward. So if you can go to the next slide. So the current status is that it is currently only a 6614 piece document. So we just have a radius over TLS, and we don't have any specification in it yet that refers to DTLS. and the specs for TCP usage are also not included in 6614. Currently, this means that there's a down reference to 6613, which is experimental. And if we want to move radius DTLS to proposed standard, it would require a separate RC7360 document. Coming from that, I've looked at all these three documents, 6613, 6614, and 7360. And I found some interesting things that I want to run by the working group. I have run some of them by the working group in our Yokohama meeting, but this is more in depth. So next slide. The first question is if we want to merge 6613 and 6614, or why I think it is good to merge them, is basically 6613 radius over TCP includes some or a lot, depending on how you read it, specification for radius TLS. Radius TLS is repeatedly mentioned in the specification of 6613. For example, there is a specific watchdog mechanism proposed in section 2.4 of 6613. They are both experimental for now. So if we choose not to merge 6613 in our BEAS document, then we need to have a down reference to an experimental draft, which probably should not be a problem, but personally, I find this has a little smell to it. So merging 6613 and 6614 means we have one document implementers have to read, and we don't have a lot of reference between 6613, 6614. The comment from Alan to just ignore 6613, yes, 6613 itself could be dropped, but 6614 is based on some details on 6613, so especially the connection handling mechanisms, what to do when the TCP connection is closed. So these things that are relevant to our radius over TLS, although radius over TCP is deprecated anyway. So that's the first thing. Next slide. And now the second question is what to do with DTLS. 6614 radius TLS plus some diffs and patches that are actually just written in RFC 7360 is radius over DTLS. So the radius DTLS RFC is basically read this document, apply these patches, then you have DTLS. So it would be worth a thought to just merge these two documents, have truly identical spec for TLS, because probably it's easier to just write it down once than to write it down 2 times, or to reference it and say, but these things you have to do differently. And you don't need to open 2 documents to apply the diff. So it's all, again, just one document that you need to read in order to understand the complete specification. Yeah, so these are the 2 documents that I was thinking of merging into a 6614 BEAS document. So if you go to the next slide, then I have basically 4 options that, or, oh, sorry. The downsides of merging them. The downside of merging 6613 is maybe there's not a lot of things that need to be updated from the radius TCP specification. Downref to an experimental RFC my personal opinion, it has a smell, but should not be a problem per se. And merging 6614 and 7360, so TLS and DTLS, would need some additional specification in the document. For example, that what could be a problem is, can an implementation call itself compliant to the new RFC if it implements only one of TLS or DTLS? That's something that we would need to discuss. Of course, the spec would be longer, so instead of having one document that specifies exactly what you need to implement, if you only want to implement radius TLS, then you have to read a document that has a lot of black paper on DTLS that you don't really need. Also, we have few differences regarding implementation and security considerations. So it would be a longer document with some sections not applying to the current protocol you want to implement if you want to implement only one of them. Yeah, so these are the downsides that I thought of in the few minutes that I had to prepare the slides. So on the next slide, I have the options. Yes. Sorry, I did not really memorize my slides by heart. So the four options we have from my point of view is first to leave RFC 6614Bs as is. So we downref to the experimental 6613. We update specs from 6613 where needed, but don't really update the radius over TCP draft and just keep it as radius TLS plain. The second option would to be include 6613, so the TCP spec in the TLS spec. We would not have a down reference, but we would have a longer specification. The third option is to leave the TCP spec out of the new document, but include the 7360, so radius DTLS, which would result in a combined document for radius TLS and DTLS. We could still update RFC 6613 where we would need it, but keep it as a downref to experimental. And the fourth option, which is currently my personal favorite, is to merge all three documents into one, with the thought of that we only update 6613 to include the specifications that we need for radius TLS, and that we actually replace 6614 and 7360. Yeah, so that's my proposal for this working group. I think the next slide is only contact information, so we can keep this the previous slide up for the discussion. Yeah.
So we have multiple choices here, and I think it's important that we see if we can reach some consensus as a group for what we want to do going forward. So why don't we throw open the floor to discussion? I think I'm trying to figure out if I can explain to you how to raise your hand, but if I could figure out how to raise my hand, I could explain that. So hold on a second while I try to figure that out.
There should be a hand icon right below the participant view in the top left corner.
Oh, look. Yes, there's a hand. So if you want to speak, raise your hand, and it's right under your name at the top. So, and if anyone wants to speak, please raise your hand. Has an opinion on any of these options. It's going to be a very short meeting if we get no opinions here. Oh, here we have Alan. Is going to have an opinion. How do I?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I much as I hate enormous documents, I do think, and Frederick's right here, merging all three is likely the best. That way we can have, perhaps a section about connection issues, a section about TLS, and then a little bit different sections on TLS versus DTLS. Some of the feedback recently from the TLS people are that DTLS really should be pronounced TLS, and we just call it all the same thing. Given the overlap between the documents, I think it may be useful.
Speaking for myself, my own opinion, I could see it going either way. One thing that wasn't listed in Jan Fred's reasoning was that makes me say leave it separate, is that we need to make smaller changes to the document. It would be more of a minimal changes thing. I don't object. I kind of think Jan Fred should get to decide since he's editing it. And I don't object to merging them into one document. I think when we do that, we have to be careful to do two things. One is that it is possible to have separately, be able to claim your compliance for the two separately. If we're very clear in the document where all the musts and shoulds are and stuff, what they apply to. We could say if they don't say they apply to both, and if they only apply to one, it will be made explicit so that you can say which one you implement. That would require a little work, though, I think, to make that as clear as possible. Also, we need to not have, I think, while we have the hood off mentality, because there are quite a few implementations, at least of Radius TLS, and I don't think we want to invalidate any of them. And so we want to be, and I realize there's even a little ambiguity about what they implement, because do they only implement 6614, or do they also implement the stuff in the diffs that are elsewhere? But I think we just want to be careful when we're doing this, not to turn it into an overhaul of how Radius works with TLS and DTLS. But I think we just making it into one document opens up more possibility of losing sight of that. I think we would need to be careful to keep sight of it. But I don't have any objection to merging them as long as we keep those two things in mind. Okay, Valerie?
As a participant with no hats, so I think that the first option is really attractive because TLS and DTLS has a lot of overlap. And what about 6613? I think it's very little stuff that is relevant as far as I understand. It's watchdog and something like this. So probably merging all these three documents into one is a good idea. And I also want to speak to relay what Paul said in the chat. So Paul is our AD. He said that he has no strong opinion about what is better. So Hannes.
I agree with what basically Alan and you, Valerie, just said. Also observing that the differences between TLS and DTLS are intentionally kept at the minimum. And so that kind of suggests that it would be a good idea to treat them in one go, but potentially, as Alan suggested, in just pointing out the different section and taking into account that a company implementing a stack wants to indicate compliance to TLS or DTLS or potentially both. So I think that should be accomplishable without a huge effort.
Alexander?
Hi. I definitely like the idea of merging everything all together. I think it's useful as something like an implementer going through and hammering through building an implementation. I think it's going to create a bit more work. I think that work is probably worth it. I think the existing documents we got maybe are good for people who have existing implementations and want to bring them up to scratch, but definitely a kind of unified document that has everything bundled into one. It's like, this is what you've got to do, is useful to someone trying to build this. So I'm in support of it. I think it's going to be a bit more work. And we'll just have to come up with something to help an implementer drag them through kicking and screaming to do the right thing.
Okay, sounds good. Jan-Fred?
A thought that just came to my mind also is, do we want to allow usage of only one TLS or DTLS, or is it maybe even good to say, please do both? I'm not exactly sure what the implications are. I can see arguments for both for and against.
Hannes?
I can easily see that someone only wants to implement one, like radius over TLS. Like I don't think you have to force people to implement both.
Heikki?
Okay.
Heikki?
So, yeah. Do you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I would also say that one specification would be good, and also would say that at this point, at least, radius over TCP and TLS would be the more important. And one thing that I know that I've seen is also that there are certain platforms where, for example, DTLS may not be available, and on those platforms, one could only implement the radius over TLS and TCP. So one spec would be good, but it would be also good that it would be possible to say that, okay, the implementation is compliant with the new specification, but it only implements, for example, the TCP version of it. That's it.
Okay.
Sorry,
So,
my session dropped there for a moment,
okay.
but I'm back. I think that from what I heard, and I'm just going to kind of, maybe Valerie can tell me if he felt differently. I didn't hear any actual objection to moving to one document, which was the editor's preferred plan.
I agree.
Is there anyone, so if there's anyone who objects to asking Jan-Fred to merge these into one document, could you put your hand up, and could we hear why? Because if something was said along those lines, I didn't hear it.
I just want to say, well, Margaret, just
go ahead.
Sorry. I just want to say that it's better to confirm this on the list, because not everyone can participate in meeting. So
yeah, everyone will. Everything we decide here will be confirmed on the list, like always for meetings.
Yes, sure.
Sure. But I don't hear any objection, so we have consensus of the room to merge into one document, and we will confirm that on the list. So, so that's good. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about, Jan-Fred, or
no,
anything for the group before we move on?
No, I think that's good. I have I have made first steps for the new document already. So now I can fully commit to this, and I don't think that someone on the list will raise an objection, but if so, then of course that would be okay. But then now I can start with a new document, and I will have an update then.
Yeah, I would guess that, I mean, just based on who's here, that the likely people that have a strong opinion have already weighed in, but we will confirm it on the list, and you'll see the discussion if anything seems to change. So just trying to call up the agenda here because I forget what's next. Radius version 1.1, Alan?
Okay. There's a bunch of slides here, so I'll go through them quickly. Do the next slide. This is a quick review of how ALPN works. The client connects over TLS to the server and sends a ALPN TLS header field saying, quote, radius 11, and the server either replies with nothing or echoes it back. ALPN has provisions for sending multiple names from the client, but that's it. Once that TLS connection is established, then you get access request and access reply, or access accept, sorry, as normal in the TLS connection. So next slide. If either end does not send this radius 11 string, then it falls back to 6614, so it's completely compatible, which is nice. In terms of making things easier for the end user, rather than having every vendor come up with their own thing for how to configure this, there's a suggested flag to either forbid, allow, or require it. And this actually helps with the negotiation because it's difficult to describe what to do when you receive this string unless there's a flag which says what you do when you receive the string. So that's all in the document. So if we go to the next slide, the code and length fields are unchanged in the packet header based on feedback from the list. The identifier is reserved and replaced with a token. The authenticator field is 4-octet token, just like diameter, and 12 octets reserved. And this allows for 232 packets per connection, which solves a long-standing issue with Radius. Next slide. All of the obfuscated attributes are encoded as their underlying data. There is some caveats around stuff like user password. It has a maximum length limitation. And message authenticator, among a few other ones, are ignored. CHAP and MS CHAP, those were never dealt with by proxies. They were just opaque blobs that were copied back and forth. So those are unchanged. Really, the recommendations in the document are lots of details on, instead of doing all this MD5 nonsense, just encode the data and stuff it into an attribute. Next slide. So based on questions on the list, there's some questions about authentication methods. All the authentication methods are entirely unaffected. The transport does not affect the authentication, right? So Radius goes over UDP, TCP, TLS, DTLS. It's all fine. The proxies use MD5 to encrypt and decrypt stuff like user password, but the actual data is unchanged from end to end across multiple hops. The benefit now about this is if some site wants to do the full security checklist, they can drop CHAP and MS CHAP locally and use something else like TLS. And then their security people can look at the operating system and go, yes, MD5, MD4 do not exist on the operating system at all. Therefore, it's FIPS compliant. This is a little stronger than what FIPS actually requires. FIPS just requires that you don't depend on these things for security, which Radius doesn't, but the number one way that people understand FIPS and the easiest way to ensure you're implementing it is just to ban things like MD4 and MD5 entirely, because it's too hard to ask the average administrator or the average company to audit an OS to see whether or not the uses of MD4 and MD5 fall within the allowed uses in FIPS. It's just easier to ban it. Next slide. So this is implemented. It's not enabled in the default build because we don't want to break things by default. On the other hand, if people want to do interoperability testing, they can build it with a special flag, poke at the configuration a bit, and get it working. In the end, the diff is very, very small, which leads me to conclude we probably should have done this originally with DTLS, but that's all water under the bridge. It's the kind of thing that can be done in a very small amount of time, plus various tests. Next slide. So to address Bernard's comments about 6421 in cryptography, this document now says, among other things, that further cryptographic primitives are forbidden in Radius, and it should be essentially finishing the research started in 6421 when coupled with moving TLS to standards-based. And then, yeah, the one minor note at the top, the negotiation status has to be cached for session resumption because TLS doesn't do this for us. So it's a bit annoying, but that's life. Next slide. So some future-looking thing, considering we're changing Radius, how does this affect new standards? And the answer is, by and large, it doesn't. This document describes how to transform any Radius thing into this transport profile. So any new Radius document that defines attributes, that defines new packets, whatever, look at this document. Here's how to transform A to B, stuff it into the Radius 1.1 connection, and it's all fine. As part of the cryptographic updates, it requires that new standards must use the existing attribute data types where they are defined in 8044. They can define new ones, but they also must use the existing obfuscation methods and not create their own. In which case, the transformation from obfuscated stuff to clear text stuff is defined and it's there. And there's only a couple odd places where it's not possible, like protocol error, which does some really weird things. But in terms of things like the status realm proposed packet type, that could be put into a Radius 1.1 connection with really minor changes. Okay. Next slide. One second. I believe that should be it. I was trying to think. There's one more thing. I'll see if I can think of it later. But there's one more thing I thought of. comments?
Put your hand up if you want to. Do you want to call him, Alan, or do you want? Okay.
Alex.
Hey. Just on the forbid bit where the ALPN negotiation, I'm trying to see a use for forbid, which wouldn't be equivalent to ignore, or is there something I'm missing here?
So the flags are forbid, allow, require. So allow means, hey, if the client, say, talks to me, it can do radius TLS or it can do this new 1.1 stuff. Either way. Require is require the new one, and forbid is require the old style. There's no particular reason for adding forbid other than, it may be useful and it sort of completes things, I guess.
Okay,
there may be
it was
benefits.
It was just in my head. It felt like an ignore. Just ignore the 1.1 stuff and draw back. But yeah, that's okay. That's all right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Jan Frederick.
Hi. So I have two things. The first thing on page 8 on the slides, you say you want to forbid any further cryptographic primitives in radius.
Yeah.
I mean, I totally get that, but if we at some point want to have something that resembles end-to-end cryptography in radius, that the radius proxies in the middle don't get data, I think the current choice of scripts in the document actually also forbids this. And I'm not sure if we want that.
Sure. Okay, so perhaps this could be clarified. The goal here is really to forbid perhaps hop by hop cryptographic primitives in radius. So new ways of obfuscating attributes. It may be worth mentioning end-to-end as an example of what could be permitted, because that arguably doesn't really define any new cryptography in radius. I mean, wave your hands about how exactly it's done, but the point is, for anything other than the two ends, the data being transported is just opaque data, right? So the per connection data is not using any new cryptographic primitives, if that makes it clear.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And the second thing, just maybe also a question for all the other documents. Do we plan to release the documents en bloc, or do we actually plan to release them step by step? Because if I would prefer, if we release them en bloc, that there is no reference to 6614 in it, because we're actually trying to replace it.
Our charter has us releasing them at separate times. I think there's a real question as to whether the deprecation document, and I think this was brought up on the list, shouldn't only follow the new TLS document or something, but the ALPN one goes out before the new TLS document, according to our charter and work.
Yeah, and I believe the status of this is also experimental, right? In which case it can depend on 6614 and there's no issue.
Okay. I did not realize that this was actually intended as experimental. Okay. I would my comment.
Any other comments? There's Matthew. Matthew?
Are you on mute, Matthew? Hearing nothing.
Okay. I'm not sure what's going on with Matthew.
Okay. I think he
Matthew,
can't get
check
off
your
mute.
mic. Check your mic status, Matthew. We can't hear you.
All right, we're just going to continue, and if Matthew comes in, he can call out to us. There's been very little, I would say, dispute about this document on the list, and the comments are largely minor and I would say friendly amendment type of things or informational question type of things. So the question for this group is, are we ready to go to working group last call with this document, or do people think that there's anything significant that still needs to be done before this document is done? So if you have an opinion on that, put your hand up and let's talk about that. Particularly if you have an opinion that there's significant work that still needs to be done. Matthew, you're up again. Can we hear you this time?
I found the unmute button at the bottom, and that doesn't work. Hit the one at the top. Just a couple of comments on the 1.1 document side. The things about forbidding things, crypto for future, or basically forbidding any work with crypto in Radius in future. I'm guessing that's really because of not Radius people not being crypto people, so therefore saying it's actually, rather than trying to forbid crypto, it's trying to say that Radius experts shouldn't be designing crypto. When I've read through the document in fair detail a couple of times, and that's one thing that just stands out, is saying, oh, we're not allowing this in the past and we're not doing it now, but we're not allowing you to do something in the future. And that feels a little bit tight. So whether that needs to be just clarified as to the reasoning behind it, rather than explicitly saying you can't do this in future, because there might be a reason for it, maybe. The other comment was just, I mentioned on the list a few weeks back about, it says implementations must support TLS-PSK. And I think the answer came back, said that would be removed, and it's still in the latest draft. But I didn't know whether there was a reason for that, or whether that was actually going to be still in there. It just feels like it's something that's not directly relevant to the to this particular draft. But that's just my couple of comments.
Yeah, I'm happy to remove that comment for TLS-PSK. It was just sort of thrown in there as part of a grab bag of might not hurt.
Sure.
In terms of forbidding new crypto, I think the move in the IETF over the last couple of decades has been to move away from per application cryptography and just use TLS or IPsec for almost everything, because once you define an application-specific crypto thing, it now needs to be agile and negotiate, et cetera, and you can dump that in your protocol. You can just throw your hands up in the air and go, yeah, we just wrap it all in TLS. Generally, a lot of application authors and deployment people prefer TLS where these packets are going across the net, because your application knows that the data is secure. The issue with IPsec is this is perhaps better for controlled networks, but your application then has no idea whether the data is being encrypted. So I think generally it's best to just forbid new crypto in a protocol.
Sounds good, thanks. Yeah.
Paul?
I think I just want to clarify, you're not banning any new cryptography from like Radius authentication mechanisms. You're looking just at how we're now adding transport security using TLS or IPsec.
Yes. Yes, I'll make a note of that. Realistically, also, and this is a related but separate issue. You know, if someone wants to come up with a variant of MS Chat based on AES rather than MD4, they could, and it could be transported in Radius. But I suspect other people would complain about that if that happened. So I'll make a note on that.
Any other? Oh, Hacking?
Yeah, there was previously a little bit talk about having the secure bit so that where all the hops secure. And is this something that is now part of no new cryptographic primitive in Radius? So it's just sort of a marker of encryption, but it's related to it.
Not really. So I had put that in as, hey, it might be useful. Feedback from Bernard about SIP, he spent 15 years doing SIP, is that they tried doing something similar in SIP and they realized it was useless. And that's the main reason it got ripped out. And there is a certain point to that. If there's a flag which may or may not appear in a packet and anyone along the way can modify the flag is informative and might be useful, but you can't depend on it. And if instead you want to have some kind of end-to-end cryptography, that requires a whole lot more work.
And I think the most recent version of Diameter also removed some of the end-to-end encryption things that they had in the first version.
Yeah, if no one finds it useful, right, then I guess it might as well not be there. The reason for me putting some of those flags into the packets would be, it might make sense, especially in a multi-hop proxy environment, to have some kind of signaling whether your transport is secure or not. The counter argument really is that this belongs in some kind of routing protocol where when all these proxies connect to each other, they make certain promises along the way. And that's less of a per packet thing. So the packets going back and forth don't really need to know that the routing fabric is secure. The routing fabric should take care of that itself via some out-of-band protocol or some other protocol.
Okay, so Hannes?
Yeah, just about Diameter's experience with these end-to-end security mechanisms. Of course, this was many, many years ago. And so while conceptually the idea of having end-to-end security over a multi-hop protocol makes a lot of sense, the community deploying Diameter didn't see that need. So that was the reason why it didn't complete in the end. But maybe now the world is different. So you never know, things change. But I think maybe in Diameter that should have failed.
Yeah, I think, and this is partly also Bernard's comment. I'll channel Bernard as he isn't here. If you're trying to transport data over proxies, the proxies are either trusted, in which case they see everything, or they're untrusted, in which case you shouldn't be using them at all. And if you really do want end-to-end security, use dynamic name lookups and connect directly from client to server. And that way you know that there's no proxies involved. And your end-to-end encryption is, you know, there's only two ends, no proxies.
Okay. It sounds to me like we need a little bit of clarification in this document about what's meant regarding forbidding further cryptographic primitives. And maybe there's one other clarification point, but there doesn't seem to be any, there still doesn't seem to be any major objection to what's in this document. So maybe, Alan, you want to spin it once to clean those things up, and then we'll look at going to a last call on the list. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll get that out this week.
Okay, anybody strongly object to that as the going forward plan? Okay, so that's where we'll go with this. Next up, we have TLS PSK.
Okay. There's only a couple slides here. Next slide. The main issue with TLS PSK is that 6614 and 7360 said, yes, you can use it, and left it at that. The issue then is the administrative interfaces. Feedback from the community has been that stuff like PSKs would be useful because certificates are hard. Some more information there about why it's hard would be useful. I have a discussion in a couple weeks with Eduroam EU that I'll be going to. Hopefully I can get a little bit more information there. One known issue with with TLS certificates is that everyone either uses a private CA, which has its own issues to manage, make some things simpler, or if you use a public CA, you now have the issues of you are lying to the certification authorities. Because the public CAs are run by the CA/browser forum. Their needs are browser needs, and that's it. So if you go to the next slide. So in terms of TLS PSK, the one thing which was sort of missed in the previous documents is that you can't just add a PSK, you also have to have an identity. Previously in Radius, the identity was the source IP address. In PSK, you actually have to give an explicit identity because, among other things, TLS requires it, and your client may be behind a NAT and may change IPs, in which case you want to use the TLS identity and not the source IP. So the administration interfaces have to be updated to add both of these fields. And for security, the suggestion is should not use the same shared secret for Radius, UDP, and TLS PSK. Otherwise, there's some thought that you could look at the Radius traffic, crack the secret, and then use that to crack the TLS PSK sessions. So it's best to require that those are substantially different. Next slide.
Sorry, there are no more slides.
Okay, I believe that's it then. Yes, thank you, Valerie. There isn't a lot to this document. I mean, if we go whole hog, it might be worth adding it to the conglomerated TLS document, in which case it gets enormous. It depends on how much content there is. This is the purpose of this document is really, hey, not many people implemented TLS PSK because they didn't know what the heck to do, right? You now have an identity. Where does that go? How do you configure it? And so everyone gave up. And this is really a documenting of how to use this protocol rather than anything else. Jan Frederick.
Yeah, I think it would be good to keep it separate, but to just back and forth reference the two drafts so that they can be published in a cluster.
I'm fine either way.
Without looking at the charter, I don't know what we said in our milestones about how we were going to publish this, but speaking personally, I don't see the value in making this wait for the new TLS document, because it seems to me this is fairly simple and could be done with the experimental radius TLS by people sooner, if we can get it out sooner. I'd be interested to know if anyone else thinks there's a reason to hold it until we do the whole TLS update. I think Alex wants to say something. I don't know what. So why don't you call on, Alan? You were.
I mean, I think it's worth keeping this as a separate document. I see it more as a how to expose and how an implementer really exposes this to the user, really, and how they can almost safely use it. There's not really, I think, as Alan touched on earlier, there's no meat in there, I guess, like describing, there's no attributes in there. There's nothing like that flying around. So I think it's useful in some ways as an advisory, and it stands on its own quite well outside of any other documents, I think. It could be applicable elsewhere. Like you could swap out radius for anything really in that sort of way. As this is about TLS PSK. That's it, really.
Josh?
Yeah, I would be inclined to merge it in the other document. The reason being that I anticipate this mode of credentialing to be the most commonly used, because for various reasons, not least it just it's the analog of what people are doing today already with radius secrets. And I think it's it's a familiar model that people are comfortable with, etc. And once it's implemented in products, I just think people will keep using it. So I think it's just a matter of just convenience. If we're gonna have this documented, and if it's going to be the most commonly used method of credentialing, we may as well put it as it were in the main document.
I guess for me, the point there, I mean, there's certainly value to having all this in the document. Hey, here's the updated radius TLS document, which says everything. There is value in that. But if it's going to be implemented, I think there may be benefit to implementing it and publishing it soon rather than later. If you look at Free Radius, for example, it's actually had TLS PSK support for close to a decade. We just did something, right? Added the PSK identity and the PSK itself to the configuration. That's there, it can be used. And there's really nothing stopping the existing implementations from slapping in PSK and other products independent of any other updates to TLS. So there's good reasons both ways.
Yeah, I take your point there, Alan. Yeah, that's a fair point.
Margaret, then.
So speaking just as a participant, I think maybe we should embrace the power of and. Like maybe we could fairly quickly publish a experimental version of this to go along with the experimental TLS, and then merge them in when the 6614 BIS is, and friends is actually published. My concern is there's just no reason to tie it to something that's going to involve, it's going to be hooked to multiple other documents. And, I think 6614 may spend some time in last call and so forth. And this document is very simple. And I want to get it out sooner, but we could get it out sooner and merge it. There's no reason we couldn't do both potentially.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I mean, if we publish this as experimental, depending on 6614, which is experimental, and then a year later added into the all-seeing radius TLS BIS document,
yeah.
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, I wouldn't bother to try to publish it standards track now with a down ref, because then you've got to justify the down ref and everything, and we could then just bundle it into the actual standards track thing when it comes out. But getting it out so people who are implementing this can do it the same way. I think we're going to get a lot of interest in radius TLS due to the fact that we've telegraphed that the IETF is going to deprecate radius UDP. So I think that getting this out so that this option is out there and well-defined would be valuable, to do it as soon as possible. So that's just my opinion, though. So what are you thinking, Alan, is next steps at this point for this? So, is there an update needed? Where are you on open issues?
Document needs an update. I will do that probably later this week. My goal first is to get the ALPN document done and out, and I can dump that all out of my queue. In this document, I don't think it's that complicated. The only real complexity in it is TLS-12 versus TLS-13. Where TLS-12, you can do PSK, it's easy, but the PSK is not tied to the particular TLS method. So there's wave your hands, various TLS issues there. Whereas in TLS-13, it is tied to the TLS version. But that requires a bunch more work to implement it, because now you have to integrate various hash functions and all that. It's a bit of a pain. So the question there is, do we go, it's probably okay to use PSK with TLS-12 and ignore various potential security issues, or do we say you have to use TLS-13, in which case there probably needs to be a bit more text explaining how to do that. But yeah, my hope, as Margaret said, is this document's fairly small. We can get it out soon.
Paul, is that something we could maybe get, the security area to get someone to look at, or get the sector to weigh in on? Because sending them a document, they're going to say, this is unsafe and it can't be done that way, doesn't seem very useful. So I don't know, is that something we could get some early review on, is whether or not it would be okay to say use this with 1.2, or whether or not we need to require 1.3 in order for this to be reasonable?
We can ask for a sector review, or we can just reach out to the TLS working group.
Yeah, so why don't we, offline figure out how best to do that. But I think getting some early feedback would be better than producing something that, gets blocked at the end. So, okay. So I'll send some mail to, you know, the chairs and Alan and you, and talk about how we get that feedback soon. Okay, so anything else on that document, Alan, or are we ready to move on to the next one, which is reverse COA?
I think we're pretty much ready. Yeah.
I think, is it? I don't have the charter up. I don't have the agenda up. I'm just getting back up.
The
I think
agenda was deprecating insecure.
Oh, deprecating. Yep. The
yeah.
radius UDP and radius TCP document.
Yeah. Okay. So we do the next slide. Yes, the original intention of the document, well, the original phrasing in the document was deprecating UDP and deprecating radius, in part to get people excited and actually paying attention to these issues. The biggest issue is that MD5 is garbage at this point. It's been cracked. Given a radius packet, a hobbyist can crack all 8-character shared secrets in a short period of time. And if someone's willing to throw money at it, low millions of dollars, you can crack radius shared secrets going up to like 10 or 12 characters. The other issues are that sensitive data such as device information and personal location is sent in the clear. Even with stuff like MADINAS, which is MAC address randomization, I wouldn't be surprised if you could still do some fingerprinting on devices. You know, looking at TLS ciphers, for example, for EAP-TLS, you could fingerprint particular devices if you wanted to. There are also issues with the security of tunnel password when sent in COA packets. Tunnel password originally depended on the random request authenticator in the access request and access accept. COA packets, the request authenticator is all zeros. So there's only 12 bits of entropy protecting the tunnel password. This had been raised by me on the radius list many years ago, and everyone sort of threw up their hands and went, well, nothing we can do about it now. But that is a serious issue for anyone sending tunnel passwords over the net. 12 bits of entropy is enough to crack them instantly by anyone. Next one. Next slide. So the proposal, just use TLS or IPsec. Bernard's pushed strongly for IPsec. He does have some good points there. Some of the original radius deployments going back to 95, 96 were massive deployments of IPsec. My counter argument to that is there's a big difference between one site deploying 10,000 or 100,000 NASs with IPsec and something like EduRoam where you have 10,000 sites interconnecting. This document hopefully should be standards tracked. Bernard was arguing against that a little bit. However, we do have decades of experience using radius over TLS. We have 10 years of experience, sorry, IPsec. We have 10 years of experience with radius over TLS, perhaps a little bit less experience with DTLS, but I know some of the large equipment vendors have been shipping that in their product and in their radius server for many years. Next slide. So we have couple of open questions. Should this document be standards track? Arguably, it can only be standards track if we have a standards track TLS document, so there is some dependency there. The issue with using TLS and DTLS is, for one, NPS does not implement either one. So this is the Microsoft Radius server. Feedback from talking to their product manager is they last did a change to it many, many moons ago, and it is dead and it will not be revived and it will not be changed. So anyone running a Radius server on Microsoft Windows either has to use NPS and not TLS, or they have to investigate alternatives. Also historically, and I think one of the blocking issues with TLS and open source was this long-standing bug in FreeRadius, which has now been addressed. And so that should help make TLS easier to use. And what would happen is the connections would just block, and this made proxies more unstable than they should have been. Next slide. I think that may be it. Yes. Questions? Margaret.
So speaking as an individual, I think that we should not, I think that we should link this document to the standards track publication of 6614 BIS, because I don't think we should deprecate the standards track solution until there's a standards track solution to point to for Radius TLS. I also think that the question of whether or not this document should be standards track is in a way immaterial. What has to happen, I think, when we deprecate something is that we, typically you write an info document and actually move the previous standard to historical. But that's not what we want to do here in a way, because the previous standard is, we're still going to be counting on it and then running it over TLS. So I'm not sure it matters whether this is standards track or not. I don't care. The question is, I guess it's going to update some standards track documents. And in order to update standards track documents, maybe you have to be standards track. I'm not sure procedurally what the right thing is there. But
yeah, and I agree. So I for that, I do think it may be better to be standards track. And officially, the recent versions have a lot more weasel words than the original one, which is sort of the shot across the bow, scaring people. This is not deprecating Radius UDP and Radius TCP. This is deprecating insecure uses of those. So if you want to run them on your private network, where you have a wire between your NAS and your Radius server, that's just fine. So 2865 and friends are not being moved to historical. They are still there. They are still valid. I believe there may be benefit in terms of publicity. I know people don't pay a lot of attention to experimental versus standards track, but in terms of marketing and propaganda, it may be better to have this as standards track so that you can point at it and go, the standard IETF approved way of doing Radius is secure, and not, this is an informational document saying you might want to do this, but you really don't have to.
Well, we could make it standards track and explicitly make it update those documents in terms of their applicability. And I think that would be the way to do it strongly. But that isn't the big issue to me. The big issue to me is what it says, obviously, but also I think it should come out with a normative reference to the standards track TLS document.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, Valerie.
Oh, no, I just wonder, does it need to be a standards track or best current practice? So probably it should be discussed with our AD, because I think best current practice is well suits for this document. It doesn't define new protocol. It defines that it states that insecure use should not be used, should be prohibited. So I wonder why it is not a BCP document.
That would be fine too.
So I think it's probably a question to our AD. Paul.
I mean, ultimately, if you send a document to the ISG, they can choose to publish it on any track they want. But
they usually
we do make recommendation typically. And so
there may be some subtle details. And why asking Paul? Because he's an author of the document deprecating IQB1. And so he probably knows much more about all these details between standard track, and it is standard track, not BCP. Yeah. But in this case, probably BCP is more applicable. So I don't know. We should check. I think.
Let's talk about. Yeah, let's talk about that offline and see what Paul thinks. He'd have to sponsor it for whatever we choose to do. So. Any other comments on this document? Anyone think this is a terrible idea? Anyone think this is a great idea and they think the document needs some work or something? I think
for me, part of this is also, sorry, just for me to close that out. There are many cloud radius providers compared to, say, 10 years ago. Pretty much the bulk of them that I've seen just use UDP. And I think this is an absolutely horrific practice to use, to do. And my sort of offline discussions with them have been, it works. We're allowed to do it. We'll just expose all of our users' information. And this is for people not even doing EAP, right? Some of them is PAP, CHAP, MS CHAP. And so rather than trying to do the propaganda way of trying to convince them, my thought here would be marketing and update the specifications to say this is a bad idea. Margaret, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really been weighing in because Bernard's been doing a good job, and you agreed to add IPsec, but I mean, it's exactly that case that we're worried about. In my day job, this has nothing to do with being the chair. Is that like we have a cloud radius implementation, and we use a VPN IPsec for exactly the reasons you just cited. So I think there are valid uses for running this over IPsec rather than because it's not just the stuff that would go through a proxy. It's the stuff that your internal clients would send that would let you not only locate that a person is at a particular business, but what access point they're accessing, could be seen on the wire. And so I think it's pretty important that you be able to secure it in that case. And TLS isn't the only way that people are currently doing that. So, Michael?
Oh, yeah.
Michael?
No, yes.
Guys, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yep, there you are.
All right, great. I do agree with everything you guys have said about this RFP and this draft. And we're a hub, a radius hub at single digits. We have plenty of interconnects using IPsec and using RADSec. So I'm happy that we're okay with IPsec and we're not deprecating anything there. I guess the only thing I want to point out is that when you move away from the IPsec to the RADSec version of procuring this, you do lose some insight when you're trying to debug packet by packet as to what's going on. And I think as we move to TLS 1.3, we're going to lose a little further insight because the certificate exchange itself will also be encrypted. So I guess the only thing I wanted to point out is that I think it would be really helpful for all radius vendors and implementers to have very good debugging in all these TLS cases. I think many of them could use a little bit extra detail there. And as we lose that insight, it's going to be important to have as much debugging information as we can get from the application. I don't know if that belongs in the draft or not, but I just thought I'd
I'd argue that it belongs in the draft, right? I mean, it could go into the TLS document, but that document's, it depends. It has to go somewhere, right? There has to be a suggestion of, hey, it's not just we're defining bytes on the wire, and if you implement it or you try and administer these systems, sucks to be you, too bad, right? I think this is a good point. There really does need to be some text going, by the way, when you get something, allow the administrator to see what's going on. My favorite, if I can say that in a negative tone, my favorite thing from various products is when you try to use the product and something goes wrong and you get an error, and then the error says failed. Now you're stuck, right? It is impossible to figure out what's going on. Whereas if you have some kind of debugging for TLS, here's the certificate I got, here's everything that was negotiated, here's what happened, here's what should happen in the future. That is absolutely valuable. I know, for my work, it's not just you can look at the source code. We have been pretty obsessive about dumping all of the TLS information there. And the feedback from people using it has been, it really, really helps understanding what's going on.
Okay. Any other comments on this document? Okay, so Mark Grayson, I think you're up next.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. Yeah, so I think we didn't get time in Yokohama to describe this this draft, draft 0. So here we've just got a couple of slides talking about the background. I know in particular, I guess from a charter perspective, we see this as out of charter, and obviously we're very busy on all of the documents that we've just been discussing. So we're recognizing we've got that issue, but still we think we'd like to share this, our ideas, and get some feedback. There's been some initial couple of feedbacks on the mailer, so thanks for those in advance. We're working through those issues, but just wanted to provide some background. So next slide, please. Yeah, so we really see, I mean, when we often talk about radius, I guess we automatically think primarily about Wi-Fi as a wireless technology. What we see is some interesting developments in the Bluetooth low energy market, where obviously Bluetooth started off as this sort of point-to-point wired replacement. And we see new functionality being delivered by that ecosystem. And in particular, the silicon providers of the Bluetooth access points have enhanced their access point functionality with virtual MAC address, where the MAC address can effectively follow the peripheral as it moves in a particular location. And so from a BLE perspective, that there is a secure bonding process that happens between a peripheral and a central. And this new functionality delivered by the ecosystem partners then allow that peripheral to migrate its bond between different access points with obviously the back-end infrastructure passing the security information credentials between the separate access points to achieve that mobility. So this is shipping today by BLE AP manufacturers. And so I guess the opportunity here, and this is on the next slide, is to take those systems, and those systems today are quite vendor proprietary. Obviously, those vendors are looking to differentiate and enhance their systems for delivering mobility. But we see some use cases where there is benefit of providing a radius interface between two BLE centrals. And in particular, that could be for supporting multi-vendor implementations when different organizations, maybe within an administration, have deployed different vendors' equipment. And in the past, I would say that BLE systems, when you bring a new BLE application, it was often the case that you bought a silo, a vertical stack of end-to-end systems. And so it may well be that you have multiple vendors' equipment already in place in networks. And so one use case is to be able to interface between different vendor equipment, but obviously the one that I think primarily of interest to us is the multi-domain environment, when we have one central in a visited domain and one central in a home domain. And so that then allows that same capability as now we move the bond between the peripheral and the AP, and now we're able to move when the peripheral becomes visible in a new network and is observed by a new AP, we have the ability to effectively move the bond to an AP in a separate domain. So that should be, I guess, familiar from an authentication perspective. The other aspect, obviously, we're talking about BLE, which is non-IP data. And so unlike Wi-Fi, when we give everything an IP address and we let it sort itself out from an IP perspective, we need to understand how to deal with non-IP data, and in particular, how a peripheral communicates with a BLE application. And so part of the draft, at least from an annex perspective, talks about how we can use MQTT to forward the non-IP data between these different domains. The intent is to move that to a separate document, a different document in the future. So that's the background. Next slide. So just from a radius perspective, we need to, so just as in, you know, if we have an EAP exchange, we pass credentials, and then we deliver the EAP MSK information towards the visited network. We need to be able to deliver Bluetooth keying material to that BLE central in the visited network. And so we have the access request, access accept or reject to the Radius server, and we need that Radius server to interface into the BLE security database. So we assume the BLE central in the home network, if that's on the top, is exposing security information that it's been generated as part of the bonding process. And then it enables access to that security information to a Radius server, which is then able to deliver keying material to the BLE central on the bottom of the figure. And then that allows then the peripheral to move from the first access point to a second access point and reestablish the bond on the new access point. So that's, I'll touch on Radius. Next slide. We talked about MQTT, and so as we said, we do have an annex describing MQTT. We're discussing where the correct home for this is within IETF, and so likely that this will move out of this draft and emerge in a different deliverable, and talking about sort of IoT operations, about how to standardize those interfaces between BLE here, but also thinking more broadly around Zigbee and other low power devices, that how can we standardize the interface to allow these sort of inter-domain roaming interfaces to be realized. And as we said, so the intent is to publish that in a separate deliverable. Next slide. So obviously we don't have EAP, and what we do from a security perspective is that we assume operation of Bluetooth privacy. And Bluetooth privacy, there is various, there's an identity resolving key, which is used by both the peripheral and the central and exchange during the bonding procedure. So leveraging, we're not looking to change the Bluetooth protocol at all, but using Bluetooth privacy, obviously we're aware of randomizing and changing MAC addresses from a Wi-Fi perspective. It's interesting from a BLE peripheral. it's permitted to change its source MAC address between every second and every hour, and how often it changes is a local configuration. So we have, when we enable Bluetooth privacy, we have Bluetooth peripherals, which is changing its MAC address, and the MAC address is shown when we have a PRAND and we have a hash, and the hash is formed out of the PRAND and the identity resolving key. And so in typical Bluetooth, a central consults this and then does the reverse, and it looks at the RAND and its known IRKs, and it does the hash of the PRAND and IRKs and see if it the hash function corresponds to the hash it sees from the source address from the peripheral, and if the hash matches, then it knows that peripheral, it has security information around that peripheral, and then it establishes the connection and the bond to that between the central and the peripheral. So the idea is to use exactly the same approach from a radius perspective. So using the PRAND in the username attribute and the hash in a password attribute. One of the comments from Josh, and interesting, talking about the MD5 discussion earlier, what was how little we've only got 24 bits of entropy from a hash perspective, and obviously yeah, so we've only got 24 bits from a hash perspective, and how do we protect that? And so that's one of the issues that we currently have listed to address. But the idea is that we pass the PRAND and the hash over radius in the access request, and the radius server is then able to do the corresponding match of PRANDs against its known IRKs and hashes to understand whether this peripheral is then known. So that's, I guess, some background to the next slide, just very quickly on the radius profile. Yeah, so this is the draft 00. So we think we need a new attribute type for NAS port type to identify a wireless Bluetooth low energy, and then we're proposing some new attributes. GATT service profile is linked to attributes in the Bluetooth advertisement. And so these may be interesting to signal over radius. They also may be used by the NAS to understand whether the advertisement is interesting to forward in a radius access request or not. And so we can include the GATT service profile in the access request. The BLE keying material, we obviously, as we said, we need to be able to deliver that from the server over to the NAS. And then the other attributes are linked with the establishment of the MQTT signaling between the BLE Central and the MQTT broker. So a broker URI, and we assume, WebSocket and secure signaling of MQTT, because we face the same issue as Alan faces from I guess a NAT gateway perspective, and being able to transition over a NAT gateway. And so if we have MQTT over WebSocket, we're able to get past the NAT gateway out of the access network towards the home network. And then we have a token to be able to associate a particular MQTT session with a specific NAS as well. So that's, I guess, a brief introduction. Final slide in terms of where we are at. And so, as I said, so a couple of comments received on the RADEXT mailer. Those are being worked through. In particular, it's interesting on the topic around new cryptographic constructs that we had in the previous draft, and so obviously we need to be able to deliver the Bluetooth keying material, and how do we protect that keying material is one of the issues that we face as it relates to this draft. But you can see there, and in terms of the IoT onboarding, it's there, and there's a branch called Issues April 23, which we're working through the issues being identified. So that's all I had. Thanks for listening. Happy to take any questions.
So I'll go. A couple of minor comments. There's a bunch of text saying this attribute is unchanged when this is used. That's not needed. The BLE keying material probably could be an opaque blob. RFC 6929 suggests that defining data structures in Radius is probably a bad idea. There are some outs to this. If this keying material is taken from another standard, then you can just go, well, here's the structure. It's defined by another standard. We're passing it back and forth, and maybe the Radius server has to look at a field, but we're not going to make people move these into more complicated Radius attributes. The issue with the IRKs, that does raise a bit of a concern for me. Trying all IRKs until you get one that matches. How many? How long does that take? Are there DOS issues there?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So yeah, I mean, sorry, those are your 3 points, I guess.
And then I just have a final comment on protecting the Bluetooth keying material. That can be done via the standard Radius obfuscation. The MPPE keys are already protected via that method. So you just say, great, we're going to use that, and everything's fine. That's it.
Thanks. Yeah. So point taken in terms of this attribute isn't used, whatever, and so yeah, that certainly will be addressed. I guess the key. The keying material, obviously, it's defined within the Bluetooth standard, but perhaps was never imagined that it would then be exposed to third-party systems, and so that's one of the challenges I guess we face. I agree from a server perspective, it's a blob, opaque blob, and perhaps then doesn't require to be expanded further. And I guess that's one of the issues that we need to work through about how best to address that issue. But it would have been nice to be able to reference some third-party specification, but obviously that doesn't exist from a Bluetooth specification perspective, because that was never the intent, I guess, when they defined these. In terms of the hashing, I guess we've done some sums, and you're right. This is interesting. Even just from a single enterprise perspective, about how do you optimize your hashing and how do you look at your candidates. There is certainly optimizations there, but I guess this is one of the costs of reusing the identity resolving key in these mobile deployments. But I think we're aware of the cost of hashing and how that can be optimized. And finally, on the MPPE and the existing EAP keying material, I'll take a look at that and see if we can then leverage that as we define the protection of the Bluetooth key material. Thanks.
So I have a question, and it may not even be a question about this draft so much as about how about the underlying Bluetooth thing. But you have this prand and you have the hash, and you obviously you can only generate that pair if you have the key. But what I'm not sure of is what stops a prand and a hash from being reused by other people during the lifetime of that prand. I'm confused about how this works.
Yeah, I guess, well, the IRKs are exchanged during the bond, and so your point is if another device selects the same IRK, maybe.
No, you have an IRK. I observe your traffic, which has in it a parent and a hash, and I just send traffic during the lifetime of your IRK with the same parent and a hash. How does that not end up being determined that I am you?
Ah, right. Yeah, but then I guess maybe that's to Alan's point in terms of the denial of service about then triggering these events. So
no, I'm talking about spoofing. I'm going to identify myself as you by just using the same branded hash you just sent. There must be some subtlety to this that I'm missing because there's lots of smart people working on Bluetooth. So it seems likely there's something else going on there that stops that.
But this is just so this is just for the to calculate the privacy address. That's all we're doing in terms of the addressing, and so it's a valid security concern in terms of being able to take a private address that you see on the wire and then retransmit a Bluetooth advertisement with the same private address. But that's the privacy aspect. It's not the security aspect. Obviously, the security is based on a different set of keys that are exchanged during Radius, and so you can't establish the secure communication with the peripheral just by mimicking its private address.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions or comments on that particular issue? The document? I think at this point we're just being asked to look at the document. I don't know. I think it's up to Paul and others to tell us if they decide we would be a potential home for this document. At this point, the only thing I know of that we've been asked to do is review the document. So next topic up on the agenda is when do we meet next? We are obviously planning to meet, I hope it's obvious, at IETF, I think it'll be 117 in San Francisco in the last week of July. But do we want to have another interim meeting in somewhere in the middle of June to progress these documents? And I will encourage the document authors to say whether or not that will be useful, and other people to say whether or not they think it would be a good use of our time. So, thoughts? Alan?
I'm okay with meeting again. I think it requires some document updates. I don't know that we actually have major content revisions here. So I think we might be okay with just revving the documents and meeting in July, so long as there's some general progress, right? So if we meet in June, what specific problems would we be solving? I mean, we can talk about other documents, or maybe the only one that really comes to mind is going over details of the TLS biz document and how that should be organized. That may also require a discussion with me and Jan Frederick.
I think there are a couple things. One is that we could do, we need to see, and probably not put them on the spot, but I think there's only real point to meeting would be if Jan-Fred will have any of those documents merged in by then, and we can start talking about the details of whether, we thought they were merged correctly and so forth. But we also have a couple of documents we didn't discuss on this call that are being proposed for the working group, the COA document and the status realm and loop detection document. And so we could also, push on those authors to rev those and discuss them on the same call. I don't know if that would be worthwhile or if we should just do it in July.
Margaret, just a note from Paul on the chat that we cannot meet within 2 weeks before IETF-117. So right. It leaves us, if you want to meet to have an interim, it leaves us with an opportunity either late June or the very first week of July.
Right. Those are the only times that would fit into the window. Jan-Fred wanted to say something, so Jan-Fred?
Yeah, so I'm not sure how fast I can have the document ready for a new version to review. I'll definitely put a lot of work into that to have it ready as soon as possible. I won't be in person in San Francisco, that's for sure. And since I have another engagement in that time, I'm not exactly sure if I can join remotely, especially given the time difference. So there is a possibility that I won't be there in San Francisco for the RADEXT meeting. So if we want to discuss my document, then we would either have to do it before or after the IETF, or someone else at the IETF should have to take over.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely talk about the document at the IETF, at least its existence and so forth, whether you can be there or not. But it would be good to have you for an in-depth discussion when the merging has occurred, or even if it's, a couple of the things have been merged in, but not all of them. So that may speak to it being good to try to have a meeting, in late June or so. First week of July is problematic because of U.S. holidays and and I'm on vacation for most of the first bit of July. So it would have to probably be late June. We can take it offline and talk about what your sort of timeline is for that. But anybody else have a strong opinion one way or the other? Jan-Fred, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just referring to Paul in the chat. Said.
Yeah, I can't see the chat and talk and do the thing at the same time. Let me go look at the chat. I can't see whether people raise their hands when I'm in the chat. I don't know how to.
Yeah,
see them both
the list seems low key enough to actually get work done without interims. Was the comment from Paul? I think so too. So, I will try to get the document ready. I will of course push an update to the mailing list once I have it ready, and then I think the list should be enough or should be a good number of people to actually have a discussion on the list without too much friction. So I think an interim would probably not be necessary for the 6614B's document. Maybe we can have an interim after the IETF in San Francisco if there are some discussion items that could not be addressed either during the IETF or on the mailing list. That might be my suggestion to move forward.
Yeah. Well, I was mostly going off of, I've never been a big interim person, but during the BOF for this, it was presented that how the working group would work, it would have regular interim meetings, which was kind of a surprise to me. But I've just sort of been going on that. If people don't feel it's useful to have regular interim meetings, we don't have to have them. I'm good with that. So why? I mean, is there anyone who objects to the plan that we'll go to the IETF meeting in San Francisco, and we will discuss there whether an interim meeting is needed to clear up document issues coming out of IETF 117? Is that a reasonable plan for people? Anybody want to suggest that's not a reasonable plan? Or I think something happened in the chat, which I can't see while I'm trying to see if people want to talk. I think that's Alan agreeing with the after July would be fine. So hearing no objection, our plan will be to meet next in San Francisco. And if we need any interims after San Francisco, we can decide that then. And I think at this point, we are done with topics for the meeting. Does anyone have any last things to say or anything?
So thank you very much for all who participated in this meeting. I think it was productive. And the chairs will request a next session in IETF 117. We will discuss how long it should be. So it's probably 1.5 hours or 2 hours. And so thank you very much for participation and for your work.
All right. Thanks, everybody. You now have 4 minutes of your life back. Bye. How do we end the call?
We finished 3 minutes before the
There must be a
deadline.
way to end the call, and I am at a loss for what that way is. Do you know, Valerie?
What, pardon?
How do we end the call?
Oh, I will end it. No problem.
Okay.
I think if everyone exited, it will end automatically.
Okay.
So
that
bye.
sounds good.